So welcome back to Contract Strategy. Brackets using NEC because a lot of the principles are generic, and what I will describe will be generic, but it focuses on NEC because that's my expert and that's probably the contract which you're most likely to use for civil engineers. Part 2. So I haven't come to the ground rules, but please can you turn your microphones off because I can hear some background noise. At the end, course aims, just as a recap, end of the 5 1.5 hour sessions, understand terminology, tools, principles for risk to use to allocate risk and reward in contracts, especially under the NEC family of contracts, and from the big picture to the small. And we started last week with the concepts, the processes, the principles, if you like. And we're going to start zooming in on the conditions of contract or the member of the family, and as a result of that be able to intelligently contribute to setting a contract strategy. This is the overview of it, and this is what we're doing today up there. So without further ado, today's agenda, more specifically, startups, agendas and ground rules. Quick reminder, quick review of the key slides from last week, quick overview of the NEC family and what the main payment options are, so that when I'm talking about the individual families, members of the family, and I say they have these options, you will have an idea of what I'm talking about. The main event is the NEC4 family slide by slide, when to use them, etc. And then a quick comparison with FIDIC JCT and not the ICS form, because the ICS form, which is the Institute of Chartered Engineering Surveyors form, seems to have disappeared without a trace. So not that. Right. Quick reminder of the ground rules. This is being recorded so that hopefully others can watch it. I do really like to have some cameras on and interact. So thank you, Andrew West out there. I can actually at least see one face and go, oh, he seems to be nodding when I want him to nod and not nodding off or something like that. So I would be grateful if anybody else would put their cameras on so I could interact. Sound off, accepting conversation. I think we already had a little example of feedback there. Do ask questions. Virtual hand up, or if you're shy, as most of you seem to be, type a message in the chat bar, and I'll periodically check in and try and answer it. So, key slide recap. We looked at this one, which was from the APM Guide to Contracts and Procurement, and we said that we've got the early stages of understanding the contract, how it can be broken down, how it can be procured, sort of an outline, the ideas, the feasibility, the selection. That gives an overall project procurement strategy where you've broken it down into packages, and you said we need a collaborative relationship for this, it's time driven for that package, but that one not, and so on, to form a brief for the people who are going to develop the detailed or the more detailed package strategy. And there could be multiple packages in a contract. That, though, then affects these things downstream. So the most obvious one is, well, okay, if we've decided on a design and build spec contract, we're not going to have a team of designers designing it directly. All right, that would be the wrong way to draft, in NEC speak, the scope document. But it also affects the select, provide and award the contract. Because if we go down, for instance, a cost reimbursable contract, we might well do that because there is no fixed scope. There is nothing to price at the moment. So how can you award it on a fixed price, if you like, if that's not the contract strategy? And then it affects how you manage and deliver the contract, and potentially how you operate it as well. We looked at the principles of risk allocation and sharing, and this is the shorthand side. And much, I think, to a lot of people's surprise, when I asked you if you insured your house, the number one factor is what's the effect on the organisation's business, with the rule being don't allocate a risk or a combination of risks to a party which will become insolvent if they occurred. because you'll have a long argument before they revert back to you. The next two are to do with management, what's more traditionally said, how you allocate risk, and all things being equal, who can best influence it happening in the case of an opportunity, or not happening in the case of a downside risk. And for minor risks, it's clarity that matters, with a preference to allocate them to the contracting party. Why that? Clarity over allocation to avoid lots of minor arguments over whose risk it is, and preference to the contracting party to avoid lots of arguments over how much. It's already in their prices. But people are strange things. Risk attitude plays a big part in that. Organizational culture. And then we looked at the thinking process behind developing a contract strategy, and we said there's an information phase, and I won't go through these things, but extracting them and then getting them clear, getting them signed off, getting consensus around them is really important, because what you don't want to do is important stakeholders come in just as you're about to let the contract and you have to rethink it. And you want them to be crystal clear, particularly those objectives as well. As an anomaly in terms of how we're doing it, of course, we're almost assuming that that's predetermined. But actually, if you said we as a client really don't like collaborating, and we're really not into good project management, I would say, well, don't choose the NEC, family of contracts. Choose another one, and then we fine-tune risk down here. We're going to be using, effectively, while it's the NEC family of contracts, we're going to be looking at which member of the family today. And we looked at where you're procuring it, the level at which you're procuring it, and be clear about it. And just as perhaps not in a construction environment, although you're getting up to the PFI environment, I was listening to a podcast, The Rest is Money, and they had a economist on, and she was talking about in terms of the Labour government's mission-led policies, objectives, and she was the one who came up with this concept, and so how that mission and the benefits and the constraints, if you like, have to be embedded in the contracts which you sign. And she was going for outcome-based contracts, which are up here, but which are much more complex beasts because there's much more interdependency. So how do you isolate the benefits that you can deliver when there's a much more complicated world which might influence all those things? How can I hold you to account when there are multiple factors beyond your influence which can lead to the delivery of those outcomes? And that's the challenge with outcome-based contracting. So then we looked at the NEC's 3 original objectives. I won't go through them. What we're focusing on is the flexibility aspects, and just very briefly, we said that NEC 4 was viewed as evolution, not revolution, and it had these objectives in there, many of which the approaches to procurement, increased use in different markets and sectors relate to contract strategy. So they broaden the contract strategy aspects of it as well. So with that very quick recap, any questions, including clarification and applications from last week? If you're brave enough, turn your mic on. If there aren't, or if you're not brave enough, write something in the chat, and I'll see if I can answer it. But while people potentially do that, just have a quick think about that. What was your biggest aha insight from last week? Okay, and again, if you want to put that in the chat, that's great. But just reflect on last week, and see what comes up. Okay, as I said, I'd be delighted if there's interaction. I like interaction. There doesn't seem to be any interaction. Right, so Unless something appears shortly, I will move on. Oh, do we have something? Nope. Yes, we did. Charles. Thank you, Charles.
Hi, Jan.
Hi. Is it
sorry?
Carry on.
Yeah, no, from last class. No, I just like the way you describe what you define the contract. You said how to allocate risks. That was quite interesting, simple and straightforward from my side. Yeah,
Right,
it's
right.
what about good understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, thanks. And that risk can be viewed also as I'm allocating an obligation to you, and the risk is you don't do it. Yeah, you can't do it. So I need to think about in the selection, can you manage that risk? And I need to think about, can you financially bear that risk if it occurs? And if it's upside, do I reward you in some way, shape, or form? And that could just be
Yeah.
it's within the prices, or it could be by some other mechanism. Okay, yeah, thank you. We've got, so what other, thanks, Charles. That's great. You can keep your camera on if you want, Charles. So what we've got in the chat is I've started listening to how big things get done, which is on Spotify. It's really interesting. Pestle. And you can apply this to all sorts of things, that acronym. So it's politics, economics, social, technical, legal, and environmental. Normally it's in risks, but it could be in objectives and so on. And you can do it with big P's and little P's. So a big P could be politics in the UK. A little P could be politics inside the organisation, for instance. Yeah. A big L could be legal in terms of the law of the land. A small legal could be the contractual bit type, so on. So you can scale that as well. Contracting strategy as a function of project complexity and timescale. Yeah, okay, and that seriously affects it. Not to allocate risk to people who might become insolvent. Another person started reading how big things get done, and it's pretty shocking how many projects go over budget. The three scenarios we were asked to look at, and whether it's a price-based or a cost-based contract, or a cost-based with some bells and whistles incentives on top. Balancing risk and reward, and the importance of job clarity up front where the contract is easily modified early on, from Luke. I'd like more on that, Luke. I don't quite, but anyway, we'll come to that. Right. Okay. Thank you for those contributions. Let's look at flexibility. So there'll be a few you might notice before. So as I said, the purpose of the NEC having flexibility is to easily select the best fit contracting strategy given the package's circumstances. And it starts with a whole family of interlocking contracts, and you've seen this one before. And basically, we're going to be going through this slide by slide. So that's the overview slide. We'll come back to it. Before we do that, I just want to go through this slide. So this slide has the different members of the family along here. And I've amalgamated all the short contracts into one, if you like. And then we've got these payment options down here. So options A, B, C, D, and E to F. One of the things we did last week was to divide contracts into price-based or cost-based contracts, or input-based. So here, options A and B are price-based contracts. And next week, we'll look at these in detail. But a price-based contract with activity schedules is where the contractor is paid for completed activities, and the sum of those completed activities is, in NEC speak, the prices, what the contractor will ultimately get paid. The key difference between an activity schedule contract and a lump sum contract is that a lump sum contract, the contractor gets paid per proportion of the associated bar that it has completed. Whereas for an activity, the contractor has to complete the activity to get paid. And therefore that puts an onus on the contractor to program in more detail at tender, to break their program down into at most month-long activities, and then during the contract an incentive to look to focus on achieving those on a monthly basis to get their cash flow. The price contract with bills of quantities is actually not quite true. It's, strictly speaking, it's a price contract with lump sums and bills of quantities. So the contractor is paid if they specify it a lump sum per proportion completed and then quantity times rate. If we go down to here, we've got the cost-based contracts. Cost reimbursable contract is where the contractor is reimbursed defined cost plus percentage fee. Okay. Defined costs can be broken down into two aspects. There's what they pay their subcontractors in accordance with those subcontracts, so directly reimbursable of those subcontracts, and according to a schedule of cost components for the costs which the contractor's incurring internally. Okay, and you tend to use them when the project is time dominated or quality dominated, and therefore it's subject to lots of risk which you haven't had time to nail down. Okay, a management contract is essentially a cost reimbursement, or in any the way the NEC is written, is essentially a cost reimbursable contract with the presumption that the contractor is going to subcontract all the physical works unless specifically identified otherwise. And rather than being paid on a cost plus basis for its own resources, they are all included in the fee. Okay, so management contracts pretty rarely used. Towards the end of next session, we'll look at management contracting versus construction management and what the difference is there. The target cost contracts are a development of cost reimbursable contracts where during the contract, the contractor is reimbursed defined cost plus fee. But at the end, that defined cost plus fee is compared with the target prices. And hopefully you're in gain and it's split in pre-agreed proportions. But you might be in pain, in which case, again, it's split in pre-agreed proportions, that overrun. Okay. What's the difference between the target contract with activity schedules or a price list, if you're looking at these ones, or the target contract with the bills of quantities? Essentially, a target contract with activity schedules, the target prices is built up in exactly the same way as under option A. So the contractor has gets the scope, breaks it down, puts it in a program, prices up them, and that arrives at the target prices. But they're reimbursed on a defined cost plus fee basis during the contract. So that's used for, are we on track, if you like. A target contract with bills of quantities, which again can be lump sums of bills of quantities. Essentially, the QSs have a very hard job. They go home after 4 o'clock on a target cost contract with bills of quantities because they have to both count the quantities and how much defined cost is being spent. All right. So the target, the fulcrum around which the pay and gain share operates, varies depending upon the amount of quantity of work that the contractor does. So that needs to be counted as well as defined cost plus fee. And that's quite a lot of work for everybody. Okay. When we look along here, some of these, actually the term services contract here, there it's options A and C are actually with a price list, as in it can be quantity times rate, but they call it an activity schedule. And last thing on this slide before we move on, we've got orange or amber ticks here, and that's because the supply contracts don't have any main payment options, but you could, depending upon how you structure the price list, say it's an activity schedule, effectively, or you could say it's a pure bills of quantities, I'll pay you quantity times rate, or you could do a combination. Or you could say, give me in the price list rates for the people, the construction equipment that you will use, and effectively it becomes an input-based contract, not a pure cost reimbursable, because it's not at cost, it's the price that you've given me for the inputs. Okay, so bear that in mind when we're going through them and what they are. That's in right. Okay. So there, Fatima, is that for me to check slide number 46 or not?
No,
Or
it's the answer for the.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. So before we go on to the rest and look at the family of contracts, just a quick reminder, there's a similar structure and terminology across the whole members of the family, except the framework contract and the dispute resolution contract. Today, we're talking about the payment options. Next week and beyond, we'll be talking about the secondary options. So it really is modular structure, and there's getting on for 30 X clauses, if you like. Under the engineering construction contract, any extent of contractor design is allowed, and you can have you can fine-tune contract strategy even more by your specific entries in the contract data. So, for instance, on a target cost contract, if I don't want 50-50 pain gain, I can just alter the entries in the contract data to change it to whatever I want. If I want a defects date, which is the amount of time the contractor has a maintenance liability, if you like, or an obligation to come back and correct defects, I can put whatever. It's normally 1 year, but I could put 2 years in. I know some contracts where they've highlighted wearing course and for roads, etc., as 5 years, because that's the design life for the traffics. So there's a lot of flexibility which you can write into that contract data. So when we look at the main options, when we look at the secondary options, we'll also be looking at what's in the contract data and how you put that into effect. So 2 more points to make. We are now on NEC4 version D. Why version D? Because they brought out some amendments, and you can see the dates there. Whatever you do, don't use version A, I would say. Okay, and the reason for that is when it came out, I did a webinar, or 2 webinars for the Association for Project Management called NEC4, the Good, the Bad and the Ugly. There were only 3 uglies. Most of the bads were things I'd like them to have done, but overall is a better contract. The one ugly was absolutely key to evaluating the change in that the contractor might be entitled to for time. And I said, this is an appalling clause, and they have since changed it, right? Okay, so it's fine in versions B, C, and D. And I think it's generally true to say that, you know, as with NEC1 to NEC2 to NEC3 to NEC4, as with B, C, and D, they've ironed out some of the, you know, the things, and they generally get better. So, Damon, you put your hand up.
Hi there. Are you able to expand on what the clause was? It's interesting to know what.
Yeah, I will, if we have time, I will.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cheers.
It was 63.5 in NEC4, which was the, and what happened was basically in the version B, they changed the wording of it. And actually in the version B, it's a really good wording. I really like the wording. But it didn't do what they claimed they were intending it to do. In fact, it had negative consequences, the wording. Okay, you can look at 63.5. You can buy my book if you want, because where I have a rant about it. But that was that. Okay. Also, generically, as short contracts are for low risk, low complexity contracts. That's the generic term they use for when you should use short contracts. So not necessarily low value, right? What that implies is that the long or the normal contracts, without long or normal in the title, are for medium to major risk and complexity contracts. So there is a, there's a relationship between size and complexity, but it's not linear. And short contracts, I think I said it last time, the short engineering construction short contract worked extremely well on a £2.5 million contract with 2 trades and repetitive work, and less well on a £500,000 contract with 5 trades and non-repetitive work. So it is complexity risk profile, if you like, not size. So let's get on to these. So the engineering construction contract, or the black book, or the ECC, it's the original member of the family. It contains the full project management provisions in terms of programming, early warnings, compensation events, the number of them, a full schedule of cost components to build costs up from scratch if there's compensation events, the full options, all 6 main payment options. And one of the things to be aware of if you're used to NEC3 is that in NEC4, across the whole family, they replaced employer with client. That came in when, or started to come in when they published a professional services short contract in 2013. And the reason was that, and I can partly claim credit for it, is that we were briefed. So me and a team from the Association for Project Management were given a brief to, we want to expand the use of NEC across different sectors. Association for Project Management at the time was looking for a new contract for professional services. Project management is a pan-sector organization. Project management can be in software, it can be in heavy engineering, it can be in whatever. Okay, so basically the people I was working with, we had people from the healthcare sector, oil sector, I'm trying to think of some others, chemical sector. They basically went, who is the employer? Okay, and it was unique to the construction sector and heavy engineering sector. So it was changed to the client in the professional services short contract, which was first published in 2013. When NEC4 came out, they applied it across the family pretty much. The other thing to be aware of is that you don't have works information in the engineering construction contract anymore, or service information in the term services contract. It's scope across the family again. So the information which specifies and describes what the contractor or the supplier has to do and any constraints on how they provide it is now the scope. Okay. The back-to-back version of this contract is the engineering construction subcontract, or the purple book, and it's still the purple book in NEC4. So it's back-to-back, or you'll see in later slides B2B for shorthand. And as again, I think I said last time, would there generally be a reason to use an older version than version? Yeah, so there's a question from Cameron. Would there generally be a reason to use an older version of NEC4, e.g. version B versus version D, or is it normally best practice to use the latest? I would say normally use the latest, yeah. But what you have is often you have contracts let under frameworks, which we'll come to. These frameworks run for 4, 5, sometimes even 10 years. I've got one running for 12 years. And they specify up front what the conditions of contract are going to be. So, and if they're subject to procurement rules, if you start changing something significant, then a losing tenderer could potentially challenge you. So they tend to run on the same version until they expire, if you like, at the end of the framework. But yeah, if it's a one-off contract, use the latest version, yeah, because they've learned some lessons and they've refined it. Okay. So going back to this, key differences which make it back to back. So it is the same, except for the people who represent the client. So the client, the project manager, and the contractor become the contractor, and the contractor becomes the subcontractor. So everybody moves down a line. It drops the management contract payment option. So there's no option F because you don't subcontract management contracts. And the timescales are altered to allow communications to go down the line. So in terms of, for instance, compensation events, if I'm a project manager and I instruct a quotation under the contract, the main contractor has 3 weeks to respond. The subcontractor for the same communication will have 2 weeks to respond and get back, so it can go down the line. The project manager at the main contract level has 2 weeks to respond to the contractor's quotation. The contractor has 4 weeks to respond to the subcontractor's quotation. So it should allow communications to go up and down, and providing a party passes them on quickly, then everybody should be with, and people do it within the timescales, which is another matter altogether. Things should happen, people should be compliant with the contract. Okay. We've got another question. How is it decided when there's a version of NEC will be updated? Well, they tend to keep quiet about it and then spring it upon you. Okay. So you have to go back to the NEC panel to ask that one. I think what happens is after a suit, I think, having said that, I think what happens is they are on their lookout for feedback and anomalies or whatever. And at a certain point, they go, yeah, there's enough of them. It's worthwhile redoing something. Okay. Launching an improvement. And these are a bit like, I mean, we don't have these now, but iPhones get updated to 16, 7, or 14, 15, 16 each year. But do you remember the days when you used to have iPhone 8S's introduced after a year? It's a bit like that. They're basically pretty much the same. They're 99.95% or not 99.9% the same. It's just a few tweaks, yeah, to a few clauses. The version B was mainly just a comma here, or this should be in italics, that sort of thing. Okay, so nothing fundamental except for A to B, right, where they corrected that clause, in my view, which was pretty fundamental. So I hope that answers your question, Andrew. We also have the engineering construction short contract, which, as I said, for low risk, low complexity work. As with other short contracts, my view and other NEC Geeks views, so NEC Geeks, well-known names like Glenn Hyde, Richard Patterson, Barry Treves, Neil Earnshaw, etc., we think it's significantly underused. If you are just letting a contract to a specialist who is very good at what they do, but they are a single, if you like, specialist contractor, this is what they do and they do it week in, week out, is there any management in there? Is there any project management in there? No. So if you let a contract under the full version, they will do one of two things. They will either price in all this project management, which is not needed, and you'll have an expensive contract, or far more likely, they won't do the project management stuff. So they will be in breach. And my experience is that the employing party also won't do all the project management stuff. And therefore, the employing party will be in breach. In other words, both parties will be in breach. And a bit more than 9 times out of 10, 19 times out of 20, you'll muddle through and that will be okay. But 1 times out of 20, it could end in a mess. Yeah. So what, and for me, 25, 26 or whatever years experience as a consultant, you can broadly divide disputes into two sources. One is people don't understand the wording and they're having arguments about what the wording means in practice. And then the other one is people just haven't followed the contract. And I would say of the things that, and there's an overlap between those, but I would say it's broadly 50-50 when in terms of me as an expert witness asking to give an opinion on stuff. So letting a contract where you can be pretty darn certain that not only is the other party, but also you going to be in breach of contract is a foolish thing, shall we say? So why do people not use it more? Well, here's my hunch. If you're a lawyer, you want things to be watertight. So you put in all the words in the contract because that way you've covered yourself. There might also be the superannuation bias, which is I get paid for writing lots of words, yeah? And therefore I will write lots of words. Okay. So this, for me, if I'm letting a low risk, low complex project, this is the one I've used. I've used it 3 times on my house, right? And for the local builders, they either ran away at the mention of a contract, or I just took them through it very quickly in 15 minutes and said, here's an early warning. If you spot a potential problem, tell me. Here's the list of events for which you get paid extra. All right. So if I change my mind and start wanting you to do something else, it's got to fall under one of these bullet points, yeah, in terms of what you get paid. Here's how much you get paid extra. So don't just give me a bill at the end of the contract and expect me to pay it. I'll expect it to know about it at the time, and I'll expect some sort of breakdown in accordance with this clause. And as I said, the builders who didn't run a mile basically said, oh, I actually quite like this because it gives me some confidence that I know I'm going to get paid for these changes if they occur. Right. The other thing which I've been going on for ages is the January 2023 update added in the facility for contractor design, which was long overdue in my view. So one of the a potential other contract which we could have used it for was to extend our attic. Local contract, we've already got an attic conversion, but Mrs. Broom wanted a bigger attic conversion. One of the things that I quickly sussed out was that people who do attic conversions, they're basically design and build contractors. And therefore, in its unamended form, for instance, I couldn't use the short form, all right, on that basis. Whereas with the January 2023 version, I could. It does allow for that. Okay. So how do you define a short contract? Well, it's basically in the title, right? Okay. So if we just go back one slide, that hasn't got short in it. This has. I think the real question you're asking, that was a sort of flippant response, is when you decide whether it's low risk, low complexity, or whether it's medium to major risk complexity. And there's some contracts which you can absolutely look at and say, but there is a grey area. Okay. And I'll give you, so one of my irregular clients is the Royal Parks, the people who maintain Hyde Park, etc., and so on. And they were, rather than doing a landscaping project, they were going to do a small building conversion, add in another building and other stuff. And they said, can we talk you through it? And they already had model forms and model scope, etc., for these scope documents, etc., and so on, which I helped them develop quite a few years ago. And we went through and they talked about, oh, it's got contractor design. Oh, we want a bit more programming. Oh, we want this. And each one of those, I could have got the relevant clauses from the main contract and added them in as additional conditions of contract. And if it was just one of them, I think that would have been justified. But I think in total, there were 4 areas where they wanted to, if you like, add in extra features which were already in the longer forms. So ultimately what we decided was it's the longer form, even though it was, I think it was thinking around about £1 million, million and a half, something, but which was quite big for them, to be honest. But it's there's a grey line, shall we say? So it's not a hard and fast rule. So I hope that gives a bit of insight, Charles. Do you feel satiated? Do you feel I've answered it?
Not really. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe I'm just missing something. Can it be defined in form of like probably cost-wise and I don't know, cost-wise or maybe duration or this don't risk?
I mean,
yeah.
Cost, duration, they are a factor in complexity, but it's actually the overall riskiness, the risk profile, and it's not in the same way that anybody who pretends that risk management is a precise science is delusional. Pretending that there's a clear-cut division between low risk and medium risk, and therefore this should be used. That's not true. There is at a certain point there's a judgment call. I suppose my guidance would be, as I did with the Royal Parks, you say, what are the specific things which add in the complexity? And if it's one of the things which the full contract handles, so we wanted greater programming input, okay, we can grab clauses and put them in. Okay, we want design and build. I don't think this was before this came out. At the end of it, we said it's the full contract because it's got enough complexity. But if it was just one of those, it wouldn't have been worth it for the management overhead. Okay, thanks. You give me the thumbs up. Oh, is it Zakira? Yeah.
Are there? Yeah. It's all right, Zach. I just wanted to ask a quick one about, is there like any legal cases which are publicly available where NEC4 contract have been tested to show on? Yeah.
Yes, there's quite a few. But this is going back 2 years where the name will come to me. Someone gave a presentation on the case law, and actually the majority of the case law on NEC contracts is actually on people have written additional conditions of contract, and it's not the core clauses, the standard clauses which they're arguing over. It's what extra clauses lawyers have written, or it's challenging the adjudicator's decision. So it's not the contract itself, but there are some cases. This is off the top of my head, so don't quote me, but I think there's probably about 10-15 cases, something like, which are purely on, if you like, the unamended words of the NEC, which, considering how widely it's been used, is not that much, to be honest. I did have an up-to-date list a couple of years ago of the case law, but I'm sure you could do a Google search and find it, and I should do it to keep myself up to date.
But just one thing about that is the court interpretations of NEC4 contracts, they do not have any implicity. It's very clear for the core clauses. Especially my fundamental question is around the most basic clause, which is being cooperative, the client and, say, for example, professional services contract, the client and the consultant, is like when cooperation is the case and when is it, it's one of the sides need to take the obligation and repair a defect or find out.
Right. Well. All right. Okay. I'm going to try and answer this quickly because you've obviously got a question, but it's not all we're talking about. All the contracts start with the parties, the project manager, the supervisor, shall act as stated in this contract and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. In legal interpretation, detail overrides generality. So most of the time, well, pretty much all of the time, it's what the specific clause says that really, really counts. However, that's not to say that mutual trust and cooperation doesn't count. There's about 10 bits of case law on that and similar wording in other contracts. And it very definitely means something. And whereas before, if as an expert witness or someone advising other people, people started quoting mutual trust and cooperation, you go, I've got you. Yeah. If you're relying upon that, we've got you. Yeah. Now,
Yep.
That informs the interpretation. And it might be, for instance, entirely feasible that an adjudicator says, actually, you are contractually in the right on the specifics, but you've been such an awkward, nasty, uncooperative, whatever, that I'm going to award all my costs against you. Because the courts can do that. There's a very recent court case on that. And it also builds the backstory. So you also, if you're putting together something and you feel that they've acted like that, you will build the backstory around that. You perhaps won't focus on it, but you'll build a backstory on it. Zach, I've got to move on because...
Thank you. No, thanks a lot.
Yeah. So don't ignore the mutual trust and cooperation is what I'm saying. But if push comes to shove, it's what the specific says. Okay. Right. Moving on to this. There is a short subcontract. Right. As well. It's back to back with the engineering construction short contract. But it can also be used as a subcontract to the engineering construction contract. So I'm a big contractor. I've got loads of disciplines to manage. I look at this subcontract and I go, it's low risk, low complexity. It's a specialist who I'm just getting in to dig a ditch from A to B and put in a pipe. And that's all they do. And they're really good at it. I don't need the full engineering construction subcontract. Okay. Or it could be used with a term services contract where the term service contractor is instructed to do a task order and they say that's a bit outside what we normally do. It's a specific task. Let's give whole or part of that task order to a subcontractor. And we don't want a term service contract subcontract because they're not going to be coming back. It's just a specific task, if you like. Again, it's significantly underused by main contractors, in my view. And again, I think that's because lawyers look at it and go, oh, we want back to back. And some of that comes from the main contractors, the clients who want things back to back, their client lawyers. And again, the January 2023 update added in the facility for subcontractor design. You wouldn't do complex subcontractor design, but simple subcontractor design is allowed for. Okay. Moving on, we've got the professional services contract, which is orange, and the professional services subcontract, which is bluish, dark bluish. When this was published, the fanfare went out that this is for any professional services. It need not be construction related. And BAA, who previously owned Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, etc., before they were broken up, they apparently let their contracts for lawyers under this, which was a shock to the lawyers who it was written in plain English, so they struggled to understand it. It had a requirement to program out their works, communicate with the client if there was a problem rather than just spend money. It was just an absolute shock to the legal profession to be contracted under this. So the full version has all the project management shebang. And as with the tendency, I think, with each successive edition, it's become more and more aligned with the engineering construction contract. So more and more, the same wording, the same obligations. I think when the professional services contract first came out, the original two, my ex-professor John Perry and Martin Barnes, were joined by Bill Waddell and Tom Nicholson, who were both consultants. So the original gang of four who developed the NEC, 3 out of 4 of them were consultants. And I think the view was, consultants, we're gentlemen. We shouldn't be held to such high standards because we're professionals, unlike those evil contractors. As as NEC has aged, they've come to the view that consultants should be held to the same standards, I think. It has an option A, activity schedules. If you can price it up and you complete that activity, it has an option C, a target contract. And it has an option E, which is an input, or up to NEC 4, it was an input-based contract in that they tendered rates, and it was how long have you used them times that rate. NEC 4 at the time, quite controversially, said actually we expect your consultants' rates to be worked out up on an open book basis. And that was a big shock to the consultancy profession. What it also means, though, is that let's say someone wanted to employ me under that, or let's say a partner in a consultancy who might be paid a low salary but a high dividend or whatever. Well, if their cost of employing that person is worked out using a schedule of cost components, you're going to end up with a very low rate. So you wouldn't get the more senior people working on the contract if that was the case. Okay. NEC 4 also dropped option G, which was the term service option. So effectively what you could do is you could employ a consultant for a period of time, 4 years, say, and then just instruct task orders rather than signing a new contract all the time. And for me, that was one of my other uglies, one of my 3 uglies. And I did a roaring business for a while, taking NEC 4 and rewriting it with option G contracts clauses in it, effectively updated option G contracts, because many clients said, actually, I don't want to appoint a consultant under a separate contract each time I want them to do a bit of work. I just want a call-off contract for ongoing services. And as I said, generally became more similar to the ECC. Professional services subcontract is new to NEC 4. And again, because it's generally become more similar to the ECC in terms of words, suitable for use as a design subcontract to the engineering construction contract. So do post questions and I'll try and answer them, particularly if they're on what I'm talking about. We've now got the professional services short contract, a really good contract, as I think you know who wrote it originally or who helped developed it. Suitable for small assignments, so 1 or 2 deliverables and or a small team. It can be used as a term contract where each task is a compensation event. So for instance, you could say this is a contract for 4 years. There is, if you like, it's a 0 value contract or 0 hours contract. There is no work which you have to do or which I have to instruct. Some of those tasks which I might instruct, I can predefine, in which case you price them up in the price list. So let's say it's a surveyor who does house survey or house and flat surveying. You could say, give me a rate for surveying a single bedroom flat. Yeah. And you just instruct them to go and do it. And you use that rate. Give me a rate for a 2-bedroom house. Go and do a survey, etc. Those could be predefined. It also says, give us the rate per hour, per day, or whatever of the consultant. If I instruct something and I can give you a clear enough scope about what I want you to do, we use those rates to come up with, if you like, a lump sum, a fixed price for doing that task. So the consultant would go away and say, I think it's 10 hours times that rate, whatever it is, yeah? Or actually, I want you to do something and I'm not sure, how much it's going to be or how long, what the scope is. So if we take my work, can you have a look at this contractual problem? Well, the first time I'm looking at it, I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know whether it's going to be a long job, a short job. I might just look at it and then ring you back and say, you haven't got a chance. So that sort of thing, we'd use my rate, but it'd be times the amount of time I actually do. And this is where I think there's an omission. For me, a subcontract version would, in my opinion, be used more than the professional services subcontract, because the professional services, well, is that true? Yeah, I think it would be by designers, to be honest. So the professional services subcontract is used by contractors on design and build jobs, where they've got a big designer and who's designing the works. But if I was a designer, an Atkins realist or an AECOM or whatever, and I wanted to employ me, as they do, or another designer for something, this would be far more suitable than as a subcontract than the professional services subcontract. So a professional services short subcontract, a PSSS, is a missing member of the family in my view. So I don't think we've got a time to do this as a sort of any feedback, but for those who did the exercise, or think of a package you were or will be involved with, based on what we've done, and that could be from last week when I sort of said here's some homework, and hopefully Kirsty's sent out last week's slides to you. Think about, with that package, whichever one it is, which member of the family would you use? And why? Just as a bit of reflection. And as you're thinking about that, if there are any questions or clarifications or comments which come up, feel free to either say them or just write them in the chat box. Someone's got their microphone on, if they can turn it off. Right, well, there's no feedback so far, and I can't see anybody typing any message, so I will carry on. So the ones we've covered so far are from the more sort of project orientated, and they're the far more standard ones. The other contract, which is wide, or I was going to go into the term services, but it's this one, is one which is very rarely used, in my opinion. In fact, I can't recall it being used a single time in its unamended form. So we have the framework contract. It's a contract for a period of time, or it's more precisely, it's an agreement, because money doesn't change hands. So under EU procurement regulation, the standard was 4 years. We're still just about subject to EU procurement regulations because we have an Act of Parliament which reflects those directives, but that's about to be replaced. It was 4 years unless there was a good reason otherwise, and you could invent a good reason otherwise, pretty much. Okay, so the water sector works on a 5-year AMP period, so they had 5-year AMPs. All right. In some industries where people need to make a big investment, the argument is 4 years is just not enough for people to recover their investment. It needs to be a multiple of 4 years, so 8 years or whatever. So a contract, it's a high-level contract for a period of time, and out of it, you could just I want to order some widgets, or a package under one of the other contracts, which we've already talked about, drops out. So it could be for design, it could be for construction, or whatever. And what this high-level contract does, which is very brief, only 2 pages, is it references schedules where the detail of the supplier in the framework contract. So you might be a contractor under the engineering construction contract, but the framework level, you're a supplier as the generic term, is how a supplier is selected for a work order or a package. Yeah. So that would be how are they selected? It's the selection procedure from memory. How is a price arrived at? Well, you use the pricing information and the pricing. Is it the pricing procedure? Something like that. Yeah. And there's a framework information, which is other high information about how they cooperate you with or work with the client over and above the individual contracts. All those schedules are written, are referenced, if you like, from this 2-page document, but they're written by the employing party, the client. I have started writing frameworks looking at this, but then pretty soon you just go, this is too brief, this doesn't cover this. So while you might find in those frameworks some of the phrases from there, probably 90% plus of the clauses are written from scratch in the frameworks that I've been involved in. As I said, it's not just very rarely used, in my opinion. I can't recall a single occasion where I've come across it. But hopefully you now know what a framework is. All right, okay. All right, you're using the framework contract. Okay. Right, from that's Andrew West. Okay. So I've come across one. Ta-da! Right. But as you said, it's right. Yeah, but it's quite a small one. It's 250k. So yeah, that's quite small. Okay. So moving on, the other contract, in contrast, a contract which is used quite a lot is the term services contract. So the grey book here, term services subcontract there. It does have options A, C, and E. So option A is a combination. It could be lump sums and it could be bills of quantity or schedule of rates. It could be a cost reimbursable contract. It could be a target cost contract, and you can set a reconciliation period. And but what I mean by that is, let's say it's a 5-year term services contract. You don't have to wait for 5 years and do a reconciliation between how much does it cost over the whole duration of the contract compared with the things we've instructed. Instead, you might reconcile on an annual basis, and if you like, wipe the slate clean on an annual basis if it's an option C contract, so that each year there's a pain gain reconciliation. It does allow for performance or plan services. So a performance one, right, would be, and I'll give an example from my first term service contract, which actually was years ago, and it was me, I modified the engineering construction contract because this wasn't in existence. But around Bristol, a performance spec, it was for maintaining the motorways. A performance spec would be that sign needs to be visible from 300 meters, say. Yeah, that means you'll need to clean it and you'll need to cut down vegetation. I'm not going to tell you when to do that, but if I do an audit and I can't see it from 300 meters, you're going to get a deduction, or you're not going to get paid as much that month. So that's a performance spec. Plan services, again on that one, it was once a year you have to clean out the drains, and we'll audit that. We won't check every drain, but when you said you've done this section, we'll go and audit it. And then you get paid for it. If it keeps on getting flooded, or if it gets flooded in that year, we might instruct you as a rate, as a called off service, to redo the drains. But it also allows for task orders, and task orders are, if you like, originally the idea was they're minor improvements. So for instance, that area, despite you cleaning the drains once a year, and another time when we instruct you, it keeps on flooding. So actually the drains aren't adequate. So rather than go to an external contractor, we will go to you directly and instruct you to do the improvement works on that. Okay, without going to another contractor. Now, that facility in NEC3 to instruct tasks, mini projects, if you like, under NEC3 was X19. So you had to include X19. The reality was that clients, in my experience, actually wanted a lot more control typically than just outsourcing it to the contractor and saying, show me the program. They wanted to be much more directing where the contractors worked. So what they did in NEC4, they said, well, first of all, X19 seems to be always specified. And actually, that could be for business as usual, if you like. So they brought these task order clauses into the core clauses, into section 2, I think it is, and they're core. Yeah, they're not an option now. And the term services subcontract is added to NEC4 and is a back-to-back with the term services contract. So exactly the same, except the service manager and the client become the contractor becomes the subcontractor, timescales change, etc. You've got the term services short contract as well. Now, this is for, in my opinion, it takes out a lot of the low risk or the complexity, but there is a nuance. These ones have the full, I should say, planning requirements, because you don't have an accepted program in the term services contract, you have an accepted plan. So planning rather than programming requirements, which is fine if you say once a year, I want you to do this, and or a performance spec, and I want to know when you're going to do it to give me that comfort when I need to vacate this room or whatever, because you're going to maintain the lifts in it or whatever it is. Yeah. For me, the term services short contract is for much more reactive works. So I used to be a trustee of a housing association for otherwise young homeless people in Birmingham. So young, our age group in theory was 16 to 25, but in reality was 16 to 23 and weighted towards 16 to 20th. So young and exuberant and often troubled. We had a lot of reactive maintenance, shall we say, yeah, where a window would get broken or a door would get knocked off its hinges or whatever. So we had a schedule of rates to do a basic repair within 24 hours, a better repair within 7 days, and a full repair within 28 days. And we couldn't really plan it. It's just that when we said it, we wanted the people to come in and do it, and we had a rate for it. So it's for more reactive services where planned works are not the main body of the services. For me, though, this would be far more useful. A term services short subcontract would be far more useful than a full term services subcontract, because my understanding is most of the providers on the market at tier 1, yes, the full term services contract, but then they subcontract out to people who maintain the lifts, people who do this specialist service. Now, that could be under the engineering construction short contract. It could be, I want to tell you when to come in and do that. Yeah, I want to plan it. And therefore, we don't need that full term services subcontract. But a term services short subcontract would be useful. Okay, so at the moment, you'd have to modify this. On the diagram, which I showed at the start showing the full program, this wasn't in there because it's arrived since. There is the facilities management suite of contracts. Now, if you're being a cynic, and I am a bit of a cynic, and I have to say I haven't looked in detail at the wording, but it was developed with the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management. And if you're being a cynic, you'd say, well, it's a rebranded term services contract, but they've changed the terminology to match that of the facilities management sector rather than the more engineering construction terminology, which you find in the basic term services contract. So it's the same except with new terminology. But there is one significant difference in that this one here is the facilities management short contract. So that suite does have effectively a term services short subcontract in it. Thumbs up from me. Okay, why can't we have a term services short subcontract? New to NEC4 was a design, build and operate contract, so called the DBOC. Now, when I say it's a mashup, it's to avoid people having to say, well, actually, I want some new build and then I want the contractor to operate it. Yeah. And therefore I need to I either need to have the engineering construction contract with a term services contract and an overarching agreement, or I need to combine them. And effectively what the panel have done is combined it, okay, into one contract with an operate phase. It only has option A, so the base payment, if you like, is against completing certain milestones. But that in the operation phase could be enhanced by a performance table, or which is quite common in facilities management. So if you meet this level of performance, you get the full payment. If you don't, we start deducting monies from you. Okay, so that's what the performance table would be. Is it a design, build, finance, operate contract? Now, you're young engineers, you might not Andrew accepted. Sorry, I can see you. Okay. But he's going to turn it off now. Gordon Brown went a bomb on design, build, finance, operate contracts. They were known as private finance initiative contracts. And then when they became unfashionable, they became known as public-private partnerships. They were basically, if you go back to the original terminology, design, build, finance, operate contracts, where the contractor only starts getting paid once they're in the operation phase. All right. So they've got to go and get finance until, well, not just until they start getting paid, until they've got paid back those build costs plus interest. So you could, with a very simple amendment, you could say, I'm not making any payments to you until this is operational. You need to go and arrange finance. I'm not interested in the finance arrangements. You go and do it. Yeah. Or you could say, rather than having a hugely complex DBFO contract, we'll have a design, build, operate contract, which the industry's familiar with, and we'll add on the fancy finance bits. Yeah. And I put this last comment in here. The operate phase could be significantly shorter than a typical design, build, finance, PFI, PPP contract. So typically on the ones used in the UK, it was 20, 25 years. Yeah. The operate phase. On the continent, apparently, it's quite common for there to be 5 years. So I want you to design and build it. Because you're operating it for 5 years, you will be looking at the operations phase. And actually, if it doesn't operate, you'll get points deducted under the performance table and you won't get paid as much. So when you're designing it, you're going to look a lot more, even if it's 5 years rather than 20 years, a lot more at how will this operate effectively. Okay. I can't recall, I've heard of it being used, but I can't recall a direct instance of it, but I would like to see it operating in practice. Moving on, there's a supply contract. This is for bespoke goods manufactured specifically for the purchaser in this instance. So not the client, but the purchaser. The scope is for the goods and services. So it's not just I'm buying a widget, yeah. It's I'm buying something which will need ongoing requirements. I should have said up here in the first bullet point, if it's manufactured specifically for the purchaser, that implies an element of design. There's going to be some design specifically for the purchaser. So it allows for, and that the default is the manufacturer does the design. And if it's a complex purchase, then there's going to be ongoing requirements. You might need training on it. You might need ongoing maintenance requirements of it. It's been where it's very commonly used is for tunnel boring machines. So on HS2, the Thames Tideway, etc., pretty much all the tunnel boring machines have been purchased this. And it goes back to, and I think I mentioned this last time, it's relationship contracting. If you're purchasing a tunnel boring machine from Germany, specifically for your project, they're going to manufacture or refurbish an existing tunnel boring machine. They're going to then bring it to site, It's then going to be assembled down a big hole. It's then going to go through the tunnel. It might have maintenance requirements. It's going to get to the end of that tunnel. It might then be disassembled and reassembled and given a spruce up and go back the other way. And then it's going to be disassembled and taken back to Germany. That is not a transactional relationship which happens like that. It's an ongoing relationship with ongoing commitments. And if things happen over a period of time, things change. Yeah. And this contract, I think the reason why people like it is because it's got that stuff in there. It's got the provisions in there to deal with that change. As written, it is not a supply and install contract, though. Okay. And that for me is a downside of it. It presumes that whatever is manufactured is delivered to site, and that, or the if you like, the site gates, yeah, and not installed. And that's an oversight. It doesn't take much, particularly if you're not in the UK, to adapt it to an install contract, essentially insurance. But if it is in the UK and it can be considered a construction operation as defined by the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act, you would have to add in extra payment clauses and adjudication clauses. But it's a popular contract for big purchases. There is a supply short contract for more commoditized items. So this is where I want 100 widgets over 4 years, or for this contract, which I'm building, I will need 50 widgets, but I don't want them delivered all at one time. Or you could have them delivered at one time, but what you could say is I want them delivered in batches. I want them delivered in batches of 10 with a known call-off time. So if I say I want that batch in 2 months' time, you've got a contractual obligation to deliver it in 2 months' time, and known prices, if you like. And the number of contractors who, given the inflation we've had, go, God, if only I've known about this 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that would have been great, because it avoids the need to constantly renegotiate prices. Yes, the supplier might have trouble getting hold of those things within those timescales, but at least they've got a contractual obligation to do it, and they have to give early warnings. Yeah, you'd be at the front of the queue, if you like, because you've got a contract for them to supply it. And if they can't, they have to give early warnings to say we've got delays, so you get much more visibility. Having said that, in its unamended form, I think if you were saying I want these widgets delivered over a 3-4 year period, I anticipate people would want inflation in there. It doesn't have inflation clauses as written. And again, as written, it's not a supply and install contract, so you'd need to modify it. Again, outside the UK, and possibly even in the UK, if it's not considered a construction operation, it's not a big thing, but it just needs to be done. Okay. So, and then we move on to the alliance contract, which I'm thinking is going to be close to the last contract we actually look at. I'll just check my check. I can't move this up. Come on. Oh, there we go. So the alliance contract, initially published in 2017 when the NEC4 came out, when version B of the rest of the NEC4 family came out, they'd done their consultation and it came out in its sort of its currentish form. The fundamental criteria for an alliance is that the objectives of the key parties are aligned to the success of the project rather than their individual contract. And it's one of the 3 forms of alliance. So let me briefly give you, tell you what I mean by this alliance. So if I do this diagram, and let's loosely base it on a true story. Let's say I'm a client and I'm a water company and I want a new water treatment centre. Traditionally, I go at a consultant and say, design it. I go to 1 or 2, let's say a civils contractor, and I might go to, and I know this says suppliers, an M&E contractor. mechanical electrical contractor. And I'd have separate contracts with each and every one of them, yeah? And I might even have target cost contracts here, which incentivize the people to work together with me to reduce costs, but under that contract only. So the designer says, I can do a shoddy design, yeah, it won't cost you much, but it will cost a much more here. But hey, I'll make profit. More realistically, perhaps, this contractor here perhaps comes up with a whiz-o-whiz way of building it better and says, can you redesign it? And the consultant goes, no, it's going to cost me money. Why would I want to do that? Yeah. Or these two contractors here, the M&E contractor and the civils, are fighting over space and who goes where first, because they're concerned about, under their individual contracts, minimizing cost. So that would be true. And you'd have the subcontracts here. What an alliance does is it aligns the motivations of all the key parties to the success of the overall project. And as per the previous slide, there's 3 basic alliances. Let's firstly do the alliance contract as published in June 2018. It's one contract. So instead of having 3 separate contracts with the client, everybody signs the same contract at the same time. Okay. It's very similar in structure in terms of those 9 sections to the other members of the family, and it covers, and effectively there's a pain gain mechanism in it. So if this water treatment centre comes in below its overall budget of £20 million, say, let's say this consultant gets 10%, this contractor gets 25%, this one 25%, leaving the client 40%. Okay. The great the advantage of this form of the alliance contract is it's not just the gain side, there's also pain side. So if it comes in over the £20 million, yeah, then everybody chips in as well. Okay. So it's got the downside risk in there. So all partners sign the same contract at the same time. That's great if you can make it happen, but it can be hard technically and legally, as in if you've got a big alliance with 7 different participants in it, getting the contract documents, and you're not going to fully design it, because then where's the ability to work together to add value if it's fully designed? But they've got to be at the sort of similar level that people can price it up enough, yeah. And all the documents have to be there legally. And you've got to get all the lawyers to agree to it at the same time. That can be tricky. I know of some alliances where actually they're not sure what version they've entered into, because the client eventually said, we've got to go ahead with it, but it's still being circulated amongst the lawyers, if you like, yeah? So people are acting as if it's in existence, but which contract, which version is in existence? It does allow for 2-stage engagement, with stage 1 being on a cost plus basis. So while we're working up this scope to get it to a state where we're happy to agree to that budget, that alliance budget, it's a cost reimbursable contract. Another downside is it's the hardest form to get one party out. So if one member isn't performing, you've pretty much got to dissolve the whole alliance and then reassemble it, yeah, which is hard. And it does have, they introduced X26, which is for a program of work, and that's where this was how the smart motorways was envisaged. The original contract would be, from memory, for about 400 million, but they would progressively add in new schemes, taking the final value to around 4.5 billion, something like that. Smart motorways were canned politically, but that was how it was envisaged to work. I should say another key difference between this is that when I talked about the budget around which the pay and gain share operates, there are far few reasons for adjusting the budget compared with the prices in the other members of the family. So that when a problem occurs, the emphasis is on how do we resolve it, not how do I say it's your fault and let's have an argument about how much extra. What that implies is that the original budget has a fair or has some monies in it for risk, right? Because we know some of this stuff will occur, but there's not going to be an adjustment for that budget. Okay. There are two others. I'm looking at time on oh crikey. There's the traditional alliance. Very briefly, there is not a member of the NEC family in it, but essentially you have individual contracts and then an agreement on top of it. Yeah. And that has joint liabilities as well. I'm going to skip this one, the X22, X12 one, and we'll deal with that later. Last contract in the family is dispute resolution service contract. It used to be called NEC3 in NEC3, the adjudicators contract. So adjudicators are third party brought in to resolve disputes. But in NEC4, they introduced in the engineering construction contract a dispute avoidance board, which is more a sort of standing board, which can be there to resolve a dispute, or ideally nip a dispute in the bud. So before it even becomes a dispute, these people with grey hairs say, have you thought about this? Yep. We've noticed that there are problems there. Have you thought about that? That would be with an ongoing involvement. The participants can say, we've got a problem. Can you give us your opinion on it? But it's not contractually binding. But if you were to have a dispute avoidance board, this would be the contract you'd employ them on. And if you do go to adjudication, it's also the contract that you use them on. I don't know where the time went. I looked at my watch, it was 11:45, and then I looked at it again, it was 11:57. So very briefly, we've gone through that, and there's the facilities management contract. Finishing off, we won't pause for questions, but do write me if you have any. Quick comparison with other members of the family. I was asked to do this comparison. This is largely from the FIDIC. FIDIC, I meant to look up what it stood for, but it stands for something like Fédération Internationale des Ingénieurs et Conseillers, or consultants, or something like that. So International Federation of designers and contractors, and so on. So in their design thing, their flowchart, they say, is it a minor works, in which case there's a short form equivalent to the short contract of NEC. No. Is it employer designed? If yes, you've got a construction red book and a construction subcontract. That would be equivalent to NEC engineering construction contract option A or B, but with no contractor design in there. If there is a contractor design and they're going to get on and do it, then you've got the plant and the design and build contract. They're the same contract. So that's where the contractor is doing the design. So that would be equivalent to option A, but with contractor design in it. You've then got the design, build, operate contract. Well, guess which one that's the equivalent to in the NEC family. Or you've got a turnkey contract, and that's where people, the name turnkey is where, here's my performance spec. As a client, I just want to come along and turn the key and it works. And again, that would be equivalent to NEC option A. And then they do say, and you can do lots of alterations to it. Also in the family is these ones. There is a client consultant model services contract. Well, that would be equivalent to the professional services contract. And a contract for underground works, which I have no idea why that's needed, but there is one out there. So that's for civils, heavy engineering works done on an international basis, where I guess it's still the predominant contract, although NEC, is catching up and being used more and more. If you're in the UK, though, One of the big competitors, if you like, is the JCT contract, which is used for buildings more. You've got these headline JCT contracts. So why do I say headline? Because if you go to the website and you double clicked on this, it would take you to another page where there are 7 forms. So there's a standard building contract with bills of quantities, a standard building contract with lump sums, a standard contract with approximate bills of quantities, etc. and so on. So there's variants on a theme and separate contracts. So JCT build in the flexibility by having different contracts rather than having it within the contract, shall we say. So there's a standard, there's an intermediate, and there's a minor works, and you can see the number of forms. There's a major projects building contract. There's a design and build contract. So so the standard contracts don't cover design and build. We'll look at the difference between management contracting and construction management next time, but they have 2 separate forms there, and we'll look at how NEC does that. And then there's this constructing excellence contract, which is equivalent, I would say, to the alliance contract, okay, of the NEC. A prime cost contract is where approximate costs, so get on and do it quickly, and it's actually a cost reimbursable contract. So that's equivalent to option E of the engineering construction contract. These are both term services contract, but this is the one where, not where we can say it as a performance or functional spec, but where we can say these are the operations we want you to do, and when you do them, we pay you for doing it. Yeah. So those could either be called off or once a year you do this. Whereas this one is a repair and maintenance, it's a reactive contract. That would be the term services short contract for me, the equivalent for NEC. And unlike the NEC, it's got 2 homeowner forms, one for if you're using an architect to manage it on your behalf, and another if you're managing it yourself. And there was going to be another slide, as I said, which would be the Institution of Civil Engineering Surveyors contract, which was basically the old ICE contract, but no one's ever used it. And when I did try to find references to it on the internet, I pretty much hit my head on the wall to find it. So there isn't a slide on it. That's disappeared. So that's it. Slightly over time, I apologize, but that's the NEC family, and that's the variants or the equivalents in other members of the family. So apologies for overrunning. Most of you've managed to stay with me. Next week, we'll be looking at the main payment options, but we'll also be looking at construction management. We'll look at probably look at early contractor involvement and the form of alliance, which we didn't really look at as well. Okay. And then the weeks 4 and 5, we'll start to go into the secondary options, including the contract data entries. So with that, I'm going to apologize for overrunning once more and say goodbye.